Old Grumpy Hunter here. Welcome to a topic that's somewhat controversial. Are you thinking about taking that advertised 100-yard shot at a deer with a crossbow? There is a lot of hype in advertisements about crossbow weight, speed, and rifle-like accuracy. I would like to make one thing clear. There's not a crossbow that will match the speed and distance of a rifle. No matter how fast your crossbow is, the speed of sound is faster. There is a myth that a crossbow will shoot like a rifle. That may be because they have some of the same features. They both have safeties. They both have triggers. They both are shouldered to fire. They both fire a projectile. Two of them have more differences than not. One major difference is that a crossbow will not shoot anywhere near the speed of even the slowest rifle. The sound of the shot will always reach the target before the arrow. If your arrow has an average speed of 300 feet per second, it'll take 1 second to reach 100 yards. The sound made by the bow covers that same distance in 0.267 seconds, or just over a quarter second. In other words, it takes the arrow almost 4 times longer to reach the target than it does the sound. Not only is the sound of the bow getting to the target faster, the arrow is making noise as it goes through the air. Let's run the numbers of what I just discussed. An arrow traveling at an average speed of 300 feet per second will take 1 second to go 300 feet, which is 100 yards. We all know that time equals distance divided by speed. The sound reaches the target in 0.267 seconds. The sound is reaching the target 3.745 times faster than the arrow. Let's look at 3 other examples. In all these examples, we'll be using a 400 grain arrow. A crossbow that has a firing speed of 320 feet per second has an average speed of 312 feet per second out to 40 yards. The sound reaches the target in 0.107 seconds. The arrow takes 0.385 seconds to reach the target. The sound reaches the target in 0.278 seconds before the arrow does. The sound is 3.598 times faster. Crossbow firing at 400 feet per second has an average speed of 389 feet per second out to 40 yards. The sound reaches the target in 0.107 seconds. The arrow takes 0.308 seconds to reach the target. The sound reaches the target 0.201 seconds before the arrow. The sound is 2.879 times faster than the arrow. A crossbow firing at 400 feet per second has an average speed of 374 feet per second out to 100 yards. Sound reaches the target in 0.267 seconds. The arrow takes 0.802 seconds. The sound reaches the target in 0.535 seconds before the arrow does. The sound is 3.004 times faster than the arrow. Humans have an average reaction time of 0.15 seconds to sound. This is the amount of time it takes for us to start moving after we've heard something. It's extremely difficult to measure exactly the deer's simple reaction time. But it's fairly simple to calculate. It's faster than a human, but you can never really predict what a deer might do. For this discussion, I will use 0.15 seconds for the deer's reaction time. There are many videos online that dispute that a deer or any other animal will, quote, jump the string, unquote. But there are just as many that show that they will jump the string. Newton's second law calculates the speed of gravity to be 32.17405 feet per second squared, which means if there's enough room, a deer could drop 32 plus feet in a second just by falling. Dr. Grant Woods did a study and found that at 40 yards, an arrow with the initial speed of 308 feet per second, a deer will have dropped over 5 inches. They also determined that an arrow with an initial speed of 276 feet per second, a deer can drop 10 inches. Dr. Wood's research also showed that a deer having its head down can drop faster than a deer with its head up. If you have an arrow with an average speed of 300 feet per second out to 100 yards, it takes 1 second to reach the target. The sound reaches in 0.267 seconds. The deer can be moving in 0.417 seconds. This is the time the sound takes to get to the deer plus the reaction time for the deer. The deer will be on the move 0.583 seconds before the arrow reaches it. An arrow with an average speed of 312 feet per second at 40 yards takes 0.385 seconds to reach the deer. The sound takes 0.107 seconds. The deer is on the move in 0.257 seconds and has 0.128 seconds before the arrow reaches it. An arrow with an average speed of 389 feet per second at 40 yards takes 0.308 seconds to reach the target. The deer hears the sound in 0.107 seconds and is on the move in 0.257 seconds, but it only has 0.051 seconds before the arrow hits. An arrow with an average speed of 374 feet at 100 yards takes 0.802 seconds to reach the target. Deer hears the sound in 0.267 seconds and is on the move in 0.417 seconds. The arrow arrives in 0.385 seconds after the deer is on the move. Arrow drop is something that is not mentioned much, if not at all. We all know that gravity has the same effect on all objects, and all objects fall at the same rate of about 32 feet per second squared. In other words, a bullet shot from a rifle and an arrow shot from a bow at the same time will hit the ground at the same time. The bullet will travel much farther down range. How much does an arrow drop in 100 yards? A 400 grain arrow with initial speed of 350 feet per second will drop 162.9 inches. A 100 grain bullet shot at 3,000 feet per second takes somewhere between 775 and 800 yards to drop that same distance. How do you compensate for the arrow drop of the bow? You raise the point of the arrow up. But how much? Most bow hunters know and understand that the farther away from the target, you use a lower pin on a vertical bow or line in the scope of the crossbow. What's really happening here? It looks like you're aiming straight and level, but in reality you're shooting upwards and creating an arc with the arrow's flight path. To hit the target at the same height as your bow at 100 yards with the initial speed of 350 feet per second, using a 400 grain arrow, you'll be raising the front of the bow up 2.422 degrees. The result is the arrow is reaching a height of 40.7 inches higher than the bow at 50 yards, before gravity has a full effect on the arrow. There is a very good chance you will lose sight of the arrow in the scope while it's climbing and then see it again before it hits the target. Using the same arrow and crossbow, but shooting only 40 yards, the front of the arrow is up 0.93 degrees. The arrow will climb 6 inches during its flight. At 50 yards, the angle is 1.168 degrees, and the max climb is 9.5 inches. It seems that every year the manufacturers are producing a crossbow that is faster and lighter than the year before. The fastest crossbow is not always the best for hunting, no matter the price. Making a purchase strictly on speed, you could be making a mistake when it comes to hunting. If you look at the fine print on the box or advertisement, you may find a disclaimer that reads something like this: speeds up to XXX feet per second. But the big print on the box reads XXX feet per second. Here's what's happening. The crossbow manufacturer is using the lightest possible arrow and or a special string to achieve that feet per second. Most likely, that is not the arrow and or string that comes with your bow. One of my crossbows is advertised to shoot 245 feet per second. The manufacturer got that speed using an 18-inch arrow, but the arrows that came with the bow were 20 inches long. I shoot a different, heavier arrow, and they have an average of 228 feet per second with that bow. Is that a problem? In most cases not. A slower, heavier arrow will maintain more of its energy throughout the flight to the target and can produce better groups. More energy will produce more penetration. One very well-known problem with faster bows is the noise. The amount of energy that most bows have is more than enough to launch an arrow and kill most animals. More energy than is really needed. So what happens to this excess energy? It's transmitted to the bow's components and becomes noise. The more excess energy, the louder the noise. A heavier arrow will suppress some of that noise because more energy is being used to launch the arrow, but there is still noise. Accessories can be added to the bow that are designed to make them quieter. The downside is the initial speed is also reduced. All this excess energy also puts stress on the components of the bow. This extra stress can lead to a failure of some type. A lightweight bow will have more noise than a heavier one shooting the same arrow at the same initial speed because the lightweight bow does not have the mass to absorb the energy. Buying a crossbow based on speed alone does not necessarily get you the highest quality or longest lasting or best performing crossbow for your money or your needs. As with any weapon, it's the shooter, not the equipment, that determines the effective range. If you're only comfortable shooting at 20 yards, that very expensive crossbow will not automatically make you a 100-yard hunter. Remember that most archery shots for hunting are 20 yards or less. By limiting your hunting shot's distance with a crossbow, you not only help compensate for hunter error, but will help with having an ethical kill and less likely to wound the animal. In the 1960s, there was a common phrase being said, "Speed kills." For the most part, that was referring to driving too fast and or the newest recreational drug on the scene. Kinetic energy is from the Greek words for motion and active work, and is expressed in foot-pounds. One of the main parts of the formula to calculate kinetic energy is speed. In fact, speed is used twice in the formula. So how much speed do you need to kill a deer with an arrow? Remember, it is the cutting action of the broadhead causing the deer to bleed out, not the shock of the impact that kills when hunting with a bow. Kinetic energy is calculated by weight in grains times speed in feet per second times speed in feet per second, and all that is divided by 450,240. The minimum kinetic energy to kill a deer with a bow is 25 foot-pounds. Using a 400 grain total weight arrow and rearranging the formula, the minimum speed required can be calculated. By doing the math, we find that we need 168 feet per second of arrow speed at the target. This is the minimum needed. Even a youth bow that shoots 195 feet per second with an arrow weighing 360 grains will have 30 foot-pounds of kinetic energy when fired. As I mentioned before, one of my bows is shooting 228 feet per second. My arrow weighs 424 grains. With that combination, I harvested a feral hog at 28 yards with it. At 28 yards, the kinetic energy was somewhere between 45.4 and 46.5 foot-pounds. So why do you need greater kinetic energy? As an arrow passes through the air, both speed and kinetic energy drops. If you start with a minimum required kinetic energy, then when the arrow gets to the target, you may not kill the animal, but wound it, have it run off, not to be found while it suffers and maybe dies from an infection or a predator. In shooting at half-inch plywood at 20 yards with a field point, the arrow hits the plywood and bounces off when using the youth bow. My crossbow that shoots at 228 feet per second, the arrow sticks out the back of the plywood 1/2 to 1 inch. My crossbow is shooting at about 350 feet per second. The arrow goes through the plywood, ripping off the fletchings, popping out the insert, and sometimes breaking the arrow. What happens if you have more kinetic energy? Other than hitting bone, an arrow does not lose much kinetic energy as it passes through the animal. Depending if you're in a ground blind or a tree stand, the arrow will keep moving deeper into the woods or gets buried deeper into the ground. Increase in arrow weight has effect on speed, kinetic energy, flight stability, and penetration, to list just a few items. How much change can you expect switching from 400 to 500 grains? If your bow is shooting a 400 grain arrow at 400 feet per second, using a 500 grain arrow, you have approximately a 10% drop in speed, or approximately 360 feet per second. On the other hand, the kinetic energy increase. The 400 grain arrow will have initial kinetic energy of 142 foot-pounds. The 500 grain arrow will have initial kinetic energy of 144. The farther the arrow travels, the more kinetic energy is maintained. At 30 yards, the 400 grain arrow will have lost 10 foot-pounds of energy, where the 500 grain arrow has lost only 8 foot-pounds. The farther the distance the arrow travels, the heavier arrow will retain more energy. There are other factors that have effect on your arrow flight. I'm only going to address 2 of them: wind and elevation. No matter the direction of the wind, it has an effect on the arrow. The effect on the arrow from a headwind or tailwind is minimal, will have a small effect on impact. What about a side wind? A 10-mile-an-hour wind from the side has the potential of pushing the arrow at an average speed of 300 feet per second, 14.5 feet. We all know that doesn't happen, but in reality it's much less. It all depends on arrow weight and speed. Using an arrow weighing 540 grains, traveling at 230 feet per second, a 10-mile-an-hour wind at 90 degrees will push the arrow to the side about 3 inches at 60 yards, where at 10 yards it may be an eighth of an inch. The effect of wind is not proportional to the increase in wind speed. A 20-mile-an-hour wind will push the arrow about 11 inches at 60 yards. With a 30-mile-an-hour wind, the arrow will be approximately 25 inches off. Of course, the deflection is dependent on arrow weight and speed. The 2 arrows weighing 400 grain and 700 grain are shot in a 30-mile-an-hour crosswind. The 400 grain arrow will drift 16 inches farther when shot at 60 yards than the 700 grain arrow. Seldom is the wind straight on, behind, or at 90 degrees. Most times there's some type of angle. These angles can have a major effect on where your arrow ends up. It's just another reason to keep your shots short. Elevation of the hunter also influences where the arrow will hit. The right triangle has 3 sides with one 90-degree angle, 2 other angles that combine 90 degrees. The 2 sides that create the 90-degree angle are called the legs, and the slope side, or the angled side, is the hypotenuse. Calculating the hypotenuse is easy if you know the length of both sides. The formula for calculating the hypotenuse is h equals square root of the sum a squared plus b squared. For example, the 2 legs are 3 and 4 yards each. The angled side is 5 yards. 3 squared equals 9, 4 squared equals 16, 9 plus 16 equals 25, and the square root of 25 is 5. So by now you're saying, what does this have to do with shooting? Well, it has a lot. When you're shooting, if you aim at the distance of the slope side, you're going to shoot high. Let's say you're in your tree stand 10 feet up, or 3.33 yards, and you see a deer that is 30 yards along the slope side. You need to aim at a distance that is equal to the horizontal leg. By rearranging the formula, we can calculate the horizontal leg, which equals 29.815 yards. Now, that little bit is not going to take your shot off very much. But what if you're in the tree 8 yards up, or 24 feet, and the deer is 100 yards away along the horizontal line? Again, I'm not suggesting you take a shot at 100 yards. The result is, an angled side of the triangle is over 102 yards. You use the same approach when shooting upward. Furthermore, you need to compensate for your angle to be able to get that double lung heart shot. So what's the best way to get the correct distance? Using your rangefinder that compensates for the angle is your best tool. It's also advised to take measurements of different objects before you need to take that shot. That way you have an idea how far away your target is when it shows up. The arrow is going to drop less when you're aiming up or down. All of what I just discussed being said, how fast of a bow, how heavy of an arrow you shoot, and how far you shoot is totally up to you. If you want to take that 100-yard shot, then you need to practice, and do more practice. It's also suggested that you practice about 10 yards farther than the longest shot you would take. Bow hunting is about how close you can make an effective shot, not how far you can make one. Bow hunting is an up-close and personal hunt. With luck, when all these variables come together, you will harvest the deer of your lifetime. In the video description, I've added a link where you can download the paper I wrote that this video series is based on. The following tables are a graphical representation of what I just discussed. You may wish to stop the video periodically to study the tables.
I call out to you when I think you're near, and that's when the fun begins. You're walking around, strutting your stuff, showing off for all the girls. But come on over here and get settled in. I'm about to rock your world, oh, 'cause I'm not that kind of girl. I'm not that kind of girl. I won't play your games like the other days, 'cause I'm not that kind of girl. When we first met, I was sitting in the grass, leaning up against a tree. You came into view, right then I knew that you were the one for me. We chatted a while and you made me smile. I put my shotgun on my knee. I led you on and invited you home to have dinner with my family. But I'm not that kind of girl. I'm not that kind of girl.
Thank you for watching this Old Grumpy Hunter presentation. Please give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and don't forget to push the notification bell.